Greetings and salutations, or shall I say salam, which is an Iranian greeting meaning hello. It is I, Mr. Nothing, the museum curator of the weird and the strange and the host who might be a ghost. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I catalog a whole bunch of unusual, extraordinary literature that I have found in my travels. It is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to focus on another collection of short stories, much like last week when I read We Love Anderson Cooper by R.L. Mazes. What makes this collection of short stories interesting is it's by Iranian women, so it's a series of short stories rather than written just by one person. I'm talking about Afsaneh, short stories by Iranian women, edited by Kaveh Basmenji, if I'm pronouncing that name right. I did make sure to look up online if I could find any of these pronunciations, but unfortunately, many of these authors are not well known, so I was unable to really find a lot of information about them. So what makes this book interesting, this collection of short stories interesting, is that they're all written as a sort of response to the aftermath of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. They're sort of written as a commentary on what it's like being a woman in Iran. And it's written with a sort of a feminist touch to it, talking about how the culture makes it very difficult for women to live successful lives, live their own lives. So that is good. I realize before I move on, I have to provide a little context about the Iranian Revolution. So this goes back to the 1950s. At the start of the 1950s, Iran was led by an empire. I don't exactly remember who was leading it at the time, but he was a well-known leader, and he was beloved by his people. He was known for caring about women, not being oppressive in any way towards them. One of the things he did was he nationalized the oil industry in his country. He wanted to make it so that Iran would start flourishing after World War II. The United States and the United Kingdom did not take well to that, and so they funded a coup within the country, and that led to the rise of the Shah. The Shah was a very oppressive ruler, a dictator who had total control over Iran through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He was oppressive, but he did lead a number of social reforms, one of them being enfranchising women, giving them the right to vote, making it so that they could get divorces if they so choose. So while there was a lot of oppression, there was also a lot of hope for women at the time. Unfortunately, in 1979, by 1979, the Shah of Iran had started to lessen the boot that was onto people's throats. There was some social unrest that was growing, and so he decided that if he wasn't hurting the people as much, they might not care that he was being a bit of a dictator. That was a bad decision on his part, as a revolution took off. Like, as soon as he took his boot off their throat, they struck back. This revolution was led by Ruhollah Khomeini, who later became the Ayatollah until his death. And the thing that was interesting about the Ayatollah was that he led the revolution, and he encouraged women to get involved. Some people have suggested that that's because he wanted them to be a sort of bullet shields, and it would discourage the Shah's guard from firing on women and children. And that was successful because the Shah's guard didn't fire on the protesters and the revolutionaries. Because of this, because he encouraged women to be involved, it would seem like he was pro-women, pro them having rights. He was going to make them an important feature of the new Iran after this revolution. Unfortunately, I feel like I'm saying that a lot, immediately, and I mean immediately, within 3 months after getting power. Ayatollah Khomeini responded by doing his best to disenfranchise women again. He took away their right to vote. He didn't let them get divorced anymore. He even reduced the marriage age for a lot of women, even going as far as 7 years old, as long as the doctor atoned to their sexual maturity, which is, I want to say, terrible on his part. So, yeah, and he also got rid of wasn't a fan of democracy, much like the Shah, and he attributed that to being like, if we let democracy in, the West will gain control. And whether or not that's true, it's still like a very hypocritical on his part. So women once again found themselves going from one oppressive ruler to another, except this time there wasn't much more freedom. It was now an Islamic nation where they had to behave and act a certain way according to the Ayatollah. And this isn't meant to be a commentary on Islam itself. This is me pointing out that women were not due for a good time under the Ayatollah. And I think they kind of sensed that themselves, as evidenced by a lot of these stories. So that's what I wanted to say there. I wanted to provide that context because without it, we might not understand these stories. It's always important to do a lot of research when you're reading about outside cultures. So, I read 3 stories for this. I read all of them, but I want to talk about 3 stories. The first one is Midnight Drum by Ferishteh Molavai. So Midnight Drum is about a woman who no longer loves the man that she married. She finds herself sneaking out and making up excuses not to have sex with him every night, and she just resents him to the point where she's no longer happy in the relationship. This resentment has sort of turned into a drum that beats every night, and she hears it, and it's sort of like she thinks that it's so loud that other people can hear it, even though she's the only one who can hear it. It's so loud, and she thinks that people will be able to know that she's not being faithful in a relationship, that she's looking for a way out, or even hoping that the man will die. There's even something to suggest that the man isn't happy in this relationship. But why are they together? Well, divorce is now illegal in Iranian society after the Ayatollah rose. So that's a large part of the story. And then there's also the aspect that if she like, the only way she can get rid of the beating drums is to submit to her husband, to have sex with him, even though that makes her feel terrible. It makes her feel as though she's being a bit of a hypocrite. I'd like to read a little passage from this and show how this helps her, but it also makes her feel worse. Her inevitable cure is the old cure of female submission. A submission polluted with hypocrisy and meekness and cunning. A deceit that conceals her desperation, but makes her wound more painful. So as you can see, having sex gets rid of some of that pain, but it brings on more because it conflicts with who she thinks she is and how happy she's not in this relationship. So, that was an interesting story that I read there. I think it's my favorite just because of how Molavai writes the woman and really gives us an inside look into what's going on in her mind, and it's not a happy place, and people being forced into relationships they don't want to be, aren't going to be happy. Another story I read was Eclipse. So an unnamed narrator is talking to their mother. Their mother is sort of catatonic. She's been for years. She hasn't been very happy since the death of a loved one, a specific man in her life. This loved one has sort of cast a shadow over the family, or has been like an eclipse, blocking out the sun, any chance of happiness. The narrator shows the mother a picture in the story, and the mother can't bear it, but over time she's starting to reconcile with the past, and so that it sort of leaves hope for the future by the end of the story. It's a really short story. It doesn't really tell you who the man is in the photo that the mother has pain over thinking about. It could be a father, could be a son, it could be a brother. I think the story more so represents holding on to the past and what that represented, rather than being stuck in the present when you can't bear to deal with what's happening in the present. Based on the cultural background here. But I think it's open to interpretation there. And then finally, the last story that I read was The Stain by Zoya Perzad. So The Stain is about a married woman who is at home while her husband is at work. And she goes about her normal routine. She watches children play in the alley. She eats leftovers for lunch. And she talks with friends on the phone and goes out to see them. She has conversations and whatnot. And then every day, like clockwork, she sits on the steps outside and waits for her husband to come home. Except there's a bit of a feeling of unpleasantness that comes from seeing the neon signs near where he comes out of. She says it's like a growing stain that just makes her feel uncomfortable. And but then her husband shows up and she feels a lot better. So that's the end of the story there. It's another short one. In particular, I think the story highlights a lot how Iranian women might be sort of fooling themselves into believing that they're happy in a relationship or in their marriage that they were forced into. Especially because the narrator frequently reflects on her marriage, and she can't remember a time where she was ever not married. And I think that's an interesting part right there, because she's either refusing to acknowledge before she was married, or she can't bring herself to acknowledge it. That period just doesn't exist. So it's either a commentary on the whole uncertainty about the marriage that she's in, or rather it's a commentary about the ideal woman under the Ayatollah Khomeini regime, where the marriage is all the woman thinks about, and she ignores all the other pain that she might be feeling. I think it's open to interpretation there, although Perdad, the author of it, might give you a more detailed explanation. It says a lot about my privilege as a white male American, that I don't know a lot about what women go through in Iranian cultures, and I feel a lot like a tourist reading this, because this isn't what I'm used to, and it feels like I'm just visiting these stories rather than living in the culture that they're in. Especially because it's a culture that has faced a lot of oppression over the past century, even. So that's Afsaneh, written by a series of women and edited by Kaveh Basmenji. I really enjoyed it, and I definitely recommend that you find it if you can. I was lucky enough to get this at the library. Again, patronize your local libraries. They have hidden gems like this. I definitely recommend going to find it. There were a lot of stories, and it definitely made me think very differently about Iranian culture. Because before I was like, oh, well, Iranian culture, that's hostile towards women, without really thinking why. But this story has really put a reason to why I think that, and it, like, I wouldn't say it validates the anger or the my feelings towards this. I would just say it educated me a little bit and helped me understand what the women are going through. So it's not just me who's thinking that. I'm being educated by these women and knowing what exactly they're dealing with in Iranian culture, what they have dealt with throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of these women, from what I was able to find, they were born in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So they went through the coup in the 1950s and dealt with the Shah regime, and then they saw the promise of the Ayatollah. They saw what Ayatollah Khomeini had kind of promised, and how he had left them behind and made things a little bit worse for them. That's what I find fascinating about this book, and so gripping and educating even. So yeah, I definitely enjoyed it. I don't have much else to say about this beyond just go out there and find books from cultures that you're not a part of. Go look for around the weird, around the world, and try to step out of your comfort zone. Other than that, I bid you farewell. Enjoy your time in the weird.